Welcome to the second panel of this morning, the Ethics and Politics of Library version 2.0. My name is Ted Byfield, and it's my tremendous honor to be the moderator of this panel. It's especially an honor because my role here will be largely perfunctory. We initially had planned to have a format similar to the first, where we would have two speakers, a Q&A, two speakers, and then a Q&A. But Jonathan Zittrain, who needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him later anyway, agreed to join us. And so he's going to wrap up the discussion, and I think probably in the best way, as many of the people in this room know, you cannot really wrap up these conversations because they tend to be very open-ended. So we will have four speakers, and then Jonathan will sort of take over the sort of substantive role. I need to stress again what Laura DiNardo said earlier, and that is that there is in fact a solemn occasion starting a few minutes after 1, and that we need to really clear out of here with what they used to call military precision. I'm not sure if they still do anymore. So without further ado, a couple of very brief remarks about this idea of the ethics and politics of library version 2.0. As if it weren't enough to be tasked with the stewardship of one of the most rarefied forms of material culture, the book and things like this, the idea that librarians have additionally been sort of saddled with the task of dealing with these issues in other refractory forms under this word digital makes things especially problematic, I think in large part because we're only beginning to really understand what digital means. We've seen some of the sort of first signs and sort of tremors of it, but really what it means and where it's going and indeed how it works is not so clear. So then the idea that 4 or 5 people would be able to talk about the ethics and politics of something that's so complicated, which in turn was already complicated to begin with, is very problematic. But we have some fantastic speakers today. The first of which is going to be Mary Alice Baish, who spends her days and probably nights as well serving, I think, as a very sort of serious advocate for legal libraries, their users, and both directly and indirectly because of that, the public at large. So I'm going to try to keep my intros to each person as brief as possible so they can establish their own context. Here is Mary Alice. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the planners of this wonderful symposium today. I hope you can see the slides okay. They'll be posted on the website along with a resource list of a number of items that some of you might want to follow up on. When President Clinton pushed the federal government into Web 1.0, resulting in the creation of thousands of agency websites seemingly overnight, this new level of openness and transparency really transformed the way that the government works and vastly improved the public's access. Unfortunately, as we soon discovered, not enough attention was paid at that time to managing the life cycle of electronic government information, including online. And this is especially true from the point of its creation through its preservation. I'm going to just give a quick view of why today I'm not as cynical as I was, say, 3, 4, or 5 years ago about everything. And it starts with Obama and change.gov. Candidate Obama made the most effective use of the internet and Web 2.0 during his presidential campaign, bringing millions of supporters together and getting daily updates, which some people, such as myself, still receive. These people met online at the local level. They held neighborhood meetings in their own homes, and they had an easy way to collaborate with the Obama campaign. Also during the campaign, Obama was the only presidential candidate to actually have a transparency pledge on his website. He spoke repeatedly and effectively about the need to change the Bush era of secrecy in Washington towards one of openness and innovation. True to his word, the president set a transition team that included members on technology groups and also on transparency groups. The transition team sent out invitations to your seat at the table, and they actually received more than 18,000 posted sets of comments from individuals as well as organizations. AALL submitted comments to the transition team, and included among them are 2 that I think are very important, especially to this audience. One is no fee public access to the PACER system for the electronic court information. And the second one is a public domain citation system for all federal legal information. In addition, I'd like to just mention briefly a report that I was involved with as a member of the steering committee of openthegovernment.org, which was created in 2003 to sort of be able to track and speak out against the secrecy of the Bush administration. And the process of getting these reports and recommendations, which do include Web 2.0 technologies, was about a 1.5 year long process. In addition, as part of one of his first memorandums on his very first day in office, it was on open government and transparency, President Obama has requested that there be an openness government directive that is due to him on May 21st. And with that announcement, he has embraced the core principles of a democracy, which are that government should be transparent, that it should be participatory, and that it also should be collaborative. In other good news, members of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy have been meeting with open government groups and individuals and all stakeholders actually immediately after the inauguration day to find out what we as open government advocates need from the federal government. And even better news that in meetings that we've had with these White House officials, they are asking all the right questions and they are listening attentively to our answers. The White House embraces Web 2.0, and I think the president finally got permission to use his BlackBerry, which was the issues there have to do with the fact that his communications are presidential records. In our view, the sun shines now on his White House website. In fact, I went online at 12:02 as he was moving to the podium for his inaugural speech and swearing in, and was delighted to see that among the early presidential pledges he made on the website was that all non-emergency bills sent to him by Congress will be made available on the site for 5 days, and there would be an opportunity for public comment on them. The website also includes a blog, which is very informative, but it's only a one-way communication tool at this point. President Obama also held a very successful online town meeting on March 19th, in which he took questions electronically from participants. The White House is also exploring new functionalities, and I think this is very important because in the tone of collaboration, the president wants two-way communications. And so they don't yet have the full functionality of allowing public comments and an exchange with staff, but they are working towards it, and they recognize that that is an important need for their site. I've also been pleased to find at the White House website announcements about some new databases that have been created, such as recovery.gov and most recently financialstability.gov. And just these are databases to help the public and all stakeholders track the bailout money and how it is being used. These are new databases that some might say were launched before they were ready in terms of their lack of completeness in many areas. They're not at all robust, but in my opinion, they're a step in the right direction, and I'm sure we'll see vast improvements to them. These databases really bring greater transparency and clarity to the immensely complex problems in the financial system and the president's plans to address them. Also changes for the White House. These are sort of challenges. These are things that were part of recommendations many of us made, and that was for President Obama to name the first White House Chief Technology Officer. This position has yet to be filled, but I know they're working on qualifications, and as much as I understand of it, the main responsibilities will be to be in charge of access and also protect privacy. How many of you have used the White House website? I mean, you may be as frustrated as I that information is very hard to find. Part of the problem is that most documents are not in searchable PDFs, and if you try to print something off, it's kind of messy. A colleague of mine, Stephen Aftergood, who puts out the Secrecy newsletter, noted in one of his recent postings that 3 very important national security documents were not available on the White House website. The OFR and the White House announced on January 21st that they were discontinuing the weekly compilation of presidential documents and replacing it with a daily compilation. That's been a problem. Some of my very astute law library colleagues have noticed that the information in the daily compilation is days, sometimes even as long as a week, after the information has been posted to the White House website. One of the challenging and new innovative databases that they are working on is something called data.gov. Some view it as sort of a data dump, but it raises a number of important issues as agencies are asked to put their raw data into this new broad database. There are concerns about the ownership of the information. There are concerns about the preservation of the information, how the information is reliable and authoritative as others choose to take it and do their own mashups. Briefly, the challenges of e-government lifecycle management are ones that I've been preaching somewhat unsuccessfully in Washington for the last 15 years. And that's at the point of creation of information, the government has to begin to think about every other part of the life cycle, including down to the preservation area. Governments need to provide robust finding tools, including the use of metadata. Governments have to be very careful about version control, and as they post new documents to the website, must be very careful that they do not take down earlier versions of an important document. For the legal community, we want to see the government's legal information at all levels of government. We want to know whether that online version is or is not official. For this community, I'm now putting citation. As I mentioned, one of our goals is to have the federal government adopt a public domain citation system. This really should be part of e-lifecycle management. It's very important to the legal community, and I think to any user of information from the government or its data, that we know that it is capable of authentication, that its integrity has been assured. Permanent accessibility, and that was a problem with the early Clinton-era websites where they might put a annual report up, and when the next year came around, they'd put the new one and take down the old one. We need permanent accessibility to these materials, and also the enormous challenges of preservation of online and other electronic information. So in the Web 2.0 environment, as the White House has already indicated its intention to use YouTube and Facebook and Flickr and MySpace, the enormity of the challenges of including that in the e-life cycle, especially as preservation, are extremely important. As I mentioned with data.gov, I'm concerned about third-party bulk downloads and mashups. How do we ensure the ownership, the integrity, and the authentication of that government information? In addition, agencies must comply with certain laws and regulations, privacy, national security, FOIA, and Section 508 of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what about the digital divide? And I'm glad John mentioned it. We must keep in mind that there are many parts of our country that are not yet accessible by quick internet access, and there are so many Americans who cannot afford computers. I'd like to briefly end on an agency case study and how we changed the culture of an agency, and it's regarding the Environmental Protection Agency. EPA announced plans to close 5 of their libraries in spring 2006. Without having much plans other than to dismantle the entire collection, what would happen to it? They really told us that they wanted to go all electronic and digitize all the materials in the closed libraries, which included 3 regional libraries, as well as the DC headquarters and chemical library. It was all going to be digital, available to everybody on their website. Stakeholders, including librarians, law professors, spoke out loudly and effectively. And we were very pleased at the beginning of the 110th Congress when oversight hearings were held on the EPA that included a discussion of the closure of the library. And the result is that EPA was ordered by Congress to reopen the libraries by September of last year, which they did. Unfortunately, they only got $1 million to do so, but they have also promised to hire professional librarians, which is good news. So in effect, the sort of story about how an agency totally failed to understand how its information is used by the public, by stakeholders, by libraries, it taught a lesson to them. They have changed their culture. They now use Web 2.0 blogs and online chat rooms and stakeholder comment opportunities, even at the local level. And they have learned that this input from the community has really helped them better achieve the mission of the agency. So in closing, I just want to reiterate that we've talked and heard a lot about the issues of preservation at libraries and digitization at libraries and Web 2.0. The federal government is in the middle of it. I don't give them an A by any ways or means, and I think there is a role for libraries as well to participate either in becoming digital repositories for some of the government information and making sure that it is preserved and available, perhaps even outside of the federal government. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Our second speaker is Michael Zimmer. And I'm sorry, I'm going to review my notes for a second because I'm actually a little bit nervous. He's an assistant professor at the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And he is also a former fellow of the Information Society Project, so it's fantastic to have him back. His work in the realm of sort of privacy, ethics, access to knowledge, and so on is very much, I think, at the heart of the kind of the kinds of questions that are coming up in this conference, and his sort of, I think, optimism, but also pessimism is also very much of the essence as well. So without further ado, here he is.
Great, thank you, Ted, and thank you to Jack, Laura, Leah, and everyone else at the ISP for putting on this event. I remember it was about a year ago that we sat down at lunch at Cozy and started talking about this, and I'm really excited to see what we've been able to pull together today. Hopefully you'll be able to see my slides. I don't know if the lights can be dimmed from up here or from the back. What I want to talk about, like Ted was mentioning, was sort of this intersection between Library 2.0, the drive for getting better access to knowledge, and concerns we have over privacy, and especially patron data, patron confidentiality, intellectual freedom, and the type of values that librarians traditionally hold very dear to themselves. And I like to view this through the frame of a Faustian bargain. This is a quote from Neil Postman, who I was lucky to study with before his death. And he pointed out that technical change is always a Faustian bargain. It both giveth and it taketh away. Not always in equal measure, but we need to understand that there's two sides of any technology that enters any information ecosystem. And that's what I want to use sort of as the framework for us to think about Library 2.0 from a political, ethical perspective over the course of the day today. Of course, we can't be hosted by the ISP without talking about access to knowledge, a core principle in any drive for human values and human development. And the group at Yale has been at the forefront of this movement. And access to knowledge and libraries share many of the same core principles. And I'm going to not go over each of these just for the concern over time. My slides are online. But ensuring freedom of inquiry, free and open access to information. So access to knowledge, and those of you in the room who come from the librarian perspective, you share a lot of the same key issues and key principles driving your work and driving your day-to-day activities. But as we know, libraries, of course, are at sort of a crossroads, increasingly being confronted by new technologies, web-driven technologies, social media, user-driven technologies. We're confronted with challenges to the historical profession, the The professionalization, the expertise that a librarian brings to our information ecosystem is increasingly being challenged. And of course, budgetary issues that we're dealing with right now. I know everyone in this room understands all of these threats, all these concerns that libraries are facing today. And Library 2.0, of course, is why we're here. Perhaps it's one of these solutions. It's one of the ways that we might be able to confront some of these challenges and help sort of reaffirm the role of the library in providing access to knowledge. But this is where Faust comes in. You need to remember, Faust was trying to achieve universal knowledge, and the way for him to do that was to make a deal with the devil. I don't think our moral dilemma is quite as apocalyptic as that, but we need to be concerned. We need to ensure that we're not making a similar bargain as we march down the path towards using these great technologies within our library systems, that we just at least take somewhat of a cautionary principle and try to acknowledge that there could be something that it's both being given and taken away when we embrace Library 2.0. So what are some of the ways that we might be engaging in this kind of Faustian bargain? Generally, the challenges of user-generated content. Josh Greenberg talked about this already this morning. We'll talk more about it this afternoon. What happens when libraries start hosting user-generated content? When you start letting patrons post reviews of books, make comments about books, who owns that content? We need to be worried about the intellectual property. What if I cut and paste a review from Amazon or from Publishers Weekly and post it onto the library website as a review of that book? What are our concerns there? There's also great concern about noise. One of my colleagues refers to user-generated content as loser-generated content, which we've all seen that too, right? So there's a concern within the profession, of course, about, okay, so what happens when we start opening up categorization, reviewing recommendation, comments, our blogs, our wikis, to every patron that we serve, and is there going to be some noise in this information that's coming from our users? And how do we sort through that? How do we deal with that? So there's a give and a take here, of course, dealing with user-generated content. And because of a lot of these kind of concerns, many librarians are recognizing they need to start monitoring these patron activities. They need to monitor the comments that patrons leave on library-hosted blogs, or monitor the reviews that are left for copyright issues, for profanity, for obscenities, for slander, for libel. And this, of course, makes many librarians uncomfortable. Freedom of expression is a core principle, and all of a sudden we need to start paying a little bit more attention about what's happening on library systems. And there's a challenge there. So it both giveth and it taketh away. And third that I'll highlight is this issue of tracking patron activity. A variety of Library 2.0 features and functions, and I'll walk through a couple of examples, really require the capture of patron activity in ways that librarians have traditionally stood up against. So this is going to be one of the key issues that I want to sort of focus on for the next few minutes of this talk. What are the ways that patron data might be captured, and what can we do about this? So we think about personalization, and of course there's a huge push to make library websites, portals, and services more personalized. You make a better connection with your patrons. You make the information more relevant to them. Many great reasons for this. But by its very nature, that means you're going to start creating user accounts. You're going to start asking patrons, what are your interests, either research interests or personal interests. You might even personalize based on their neighborhood or other types of hobbies, other things. You can just think about creating a version of My Yahoo for your library. This is an early version of Cornell's My Library. There's a lot of platforms out there to do this. But inherent with this, you're going to start creating a larger data set of what I am as a library patron and what my interests are. And you're going to have that data housed within your systems. So there's going to be a concern there about capturing some of my personal interests that otherwise may not be as freely shared within the library system. Recommendation systems. A growing movement to basically create an Amazon-type algorithm for library services. And this would be great. Imagine other patrons that checked out this book also checked out these 3 books. Maybe you'd be interested in that. I would love to see that when I'm searching through, my academic library. But in order to make these algorithms work, in order to just sort of serve that long tail, It requires an incredible amount of information and data. And this is what, Amazon, Netflix, and even Google from their perspective, this is what they're good at, collecting that data and crunching those numbers. So if we're going to go down that path, we need to be recognize that we're going to have large data sets of patron activity, both their borrowing activity and even what they do on OPAC, where their clickstream data, all this kind of information that you hear people like me complain about Google having. Now I need to be thinking about whether or not, my local library also has this kind of information. Participating in social networking. And this is probably the easiest way for libraries to enter the 2.0 world. Create a Facebook page, create a MySpace page. Start friending patrons, start pushing data that way. But inherent with any participation in these networks, all of a sudden you're not only taking the sort of library patron interface outside of the library and into a different context, you inevitably get access to patron information. The friends on my Facebook feed can see what I'm doing, and depending on how I control my flow of information, you as a librarian or as an institution might suddenly have access to information that you didn't want to know. You didn't want to know what that patron was doing last night, and they just posted some pictures. And the way that some of these platforms are built, some of that data is just pushed automatically to you. So we need to be concerned about what we do with that data, how we interface with these kind of platforms. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about creating third-party applications or widgets. This is a great opportunity for libraries to start providing their services and pushing them out to patrons. So instead of building a very robust website for yourself, create a small little widget for interacting with the reference desk, or for accessing the catalog, or for helping students with their homework. They post that widget on their Facebook page, or on their iGoogle homepage, or on the dashboard of their Mac, or on their iPhone. And they can access your services that way on their own terms. And it's a great opportunity. But the concern here, most of the platforms for this kind of information exchange are built on an advertising model. They're built with the intention that you're going to want to collect information about what your customers are doing with these widgets. You're going to get all kinds of flows of information coming back to you because that's how these platforms are built. This is just an example of a Facebook app where the whole purpose of that app is to show people how much information you're sharing just by installing a Facebook application. So you can install the Vampire Byte application or some of these silly things that we have on Facebook, but you're actually sharing with those developers pretty much everything in your profile and a lot of things in your friends' profiles. So that's something we need to be concerned with when we start thinking about these kind of concerns. So from contextually, everyone in the room understands what's on this slide. Librarians have had a strong historical resistance to having patron data. The original Libraries Bill of Rights, various things, various instances in the history of libraries. The USA Patriot Act and the concerns with whether or not the government could access patron information. Libraries, perhaps even people in this room, just started deleting databases because they just didn't want to be in that kind of position. So of course, we're starting to face this now. This is our Faustian bargain. We have this history, we have this ethics as librarians and information professionals. But as we enter into this Library 2.0 realm, we need to understand how does it taketh away? How do we approach, how do we deal with this? I'm running out of time, so I just want to quickly talk about, libraries could resist 2.0. We could say we're going to stand back. We're going to be the last safe harbor for completely anonymous and confidential information-seeking activities, and just let everything else happen on its own, and we'll stay in this sort of final bastion. Or we could embrace Library 2.0, pursue it. We'll collect some data, and we might retreat a little bit from our sort of historical and traditional reluctance towards having this kind of information. So if we take that as our position, one of the things that I think we need to be concerned with and approach are developing some best practices. And this is something that's a work in progress for me. And look forward to talking and working with all of you in this room in terms of how to develop these kind of best practices for libraries, following the Code of Fair Information Practices, making sure that patrons have proper notice and consent, and in fact reminding them of what's being collected. Facebook, you click off the terms of service and you forget about it. 2 years later, you're sharing all kinds of stuff that you didn't think about when you first clicked OK on that. So let's remind our patrons, by the way, you're sharing this information. Create separate accounts when we can. If we're going to do the slick 2.0 stuff, keep it separate from their actual borrowing account unless they agree to put them together, and we build that kind of infrastructure. Avoid external data collection when we're doing social media. Avoid using tracking cookies. It's great that the White House does everything they do, but when they throw on YouTube videos and you get a Google cookie when you go to the page, there's a problem there. We need to be aware of those kind of concerns and those kind of issues. Anonymize our activity logs to the best we can. And we can talk more about this because this is not a perfect solution. And there's been a lot of examples about how anonymous quote-unquote logs can be re-identified with relative ease, but it's an important step for us to take. And of course, don't give the data to anybody. Not to the government, not to advertisers, not to your development team, not to your fundraisers. Keep this kind of borrowing and collection activities to yourselves for your own internal processing. We'll close with that. Another quote from Neil. What I'm trying to do is just make sure that we're not putting on blinders so we understand the ideological meanings behind our technologies. And so when we approach Library 2.0, which I think we should, that we understand this bargain that we're making and we make the right kind of decisions in order to make it helpful and useful for our patrons and ourselves. So thank you very much.